In February 2014, the state of Texas carried out a rare sentence: the execution of a woman. Suzanne Margaret Basso, a self-styled Southern belle with a trail of lies and manipulation, became one of only a handful of women put to death in the United States in modern history. Her victim was Louis "Buddy" Musso, a 59-year-old man with the mind of a child, known for his kindness and trusting nature. When Buddy left his New Jersey home for Texas, he thought he was chasing love. He didn't know he was walking into a nightmare. Over days, he would be beaten, burned, and humiliated in ways so cruel they defy belief, all for a few $1,000s in life insurance. And at the center of it all was Suzanne Basso, the woman he believed cared for him. It would take 15 years of legal battles before Basso took her final walk to the execution chamber. She refused a last meal, spoke almost no final words, and met her end with a nod to friends in the witness room. To understand how a vulnerable man's trust was betrayed in the most horrific way, and how his killer became one of the rare women executed in Texas history, we have to go back to the beginning. But first, hit subscribe and tap the notification bell, because this is not just a story about murder. It's about manipulation, cruelty, and a justice system that rarely sends women to death row. 3 to 10 o'clock. Background of the victim: Louis "Buddy" Musso. Visuals: a gentle sunrise over a quiet New Jersey neighborhood in the late 1990s, birdsong faint in the background. Family snapshots of Louis "Buddy" Musso smiling at barbecues, dressed neatly for church, laughing with friends. Church group photos, his arm draped warmly over the shoulders of other parishioners. Footage of modest suburban streets, the camera slowly tracking past picket fences and small gardens. Transition to Houston suburbs, palm trees swaying, warmer light, hinting at the journey ahead. Louis "Buddy" Musso was born in 1939 in New Jersey, the middle child in a working-class Catholic family. From the moment he entered the world, Buddy's life was defined by kindness, and by a certain innocence that never left him. He was mentally impaired, with the intellectual capacity of a young teenager, but his spirit was pure, unguarded, and trusting to a fault. He found joy in the smallest of things: Sunday Mass, an afternoon walk, the smell of home-cooked pasta, and conversations with strangers who quickly became friends. In his hometown, everyone knew Buddy. He was the man who would wave at passing cars, who never forgot a birthday, who could spend hours talking about baseball or sharing a pot of coffee at the local diner. His faith was unshakable, his manners impeccable. He still opened doors for strangers and said grace before every meal. But what made Buddy so beloved also made him vulnerable. He believed the best in everyone, even when they didn't deserve it. In 1997, Buddy's life took what seemed to be a hopeful turn. Through church gatherings and mutual acquaintances, he met a woman named Suzanne Basso. She carried herself with a charm that seemed larger than life, speaking with a southern drawl, telling grand stories about her family's wealth, and hinting at a future filled with comfort and love. To Buddy, who had long dreamed of companionship and marriage, Suzanne was a godsend. They spoke often, exchanged affectionate words, and she painted a picture of a new beginning in Texas: sunshine, a warm home, and the promise that she would be his wife. Buddy's family and friends were wary. There was something about Suzanne that didn't sit right with them. The inconsistencies in her stories, the way she seemed more interested in his finances than his feelings. But Buddy, ever hopeful, brushed their concerns aside. When Suzanne invited him to Houston in the summer of 1998, he saw it as the start of his happily ever after. He packed his bags, left the familiarity of his New Jersey neighborhood, and set off for Texas, unaware that the woman he trusted was leading him not toward love, but toward a trap from which he would never return. 10 to 20 hours. Background of Suzanne Margaret Basso. Visuals: faded black and white childhood photos from Schenectady, New York, small houses, neighborhood kids playing in the street. Grainy images of school yearbooks, with Suzanne's younger face circled in red. Shots of yellowed police and prison records spread across a desk. Video clips of southern homes, magnolia trees, and antique furniture, contrasted with footage of dingy apartments and cluttered yards. A reenacted silhouette of a woman in a frilly dress speaking with exaggerated charm, her Southern Belle act, fading into her prison mugshot. Suzanne Margaret Basso began life in 1954 as Suzanne Burns in the industrial city of Schenectady, New York. From the outside, her early years looked unremarkable, but behind closed doors, her childhood was shaped by instability and conflict. Family members later spoke of dysfunction, strained relationships, questionable influences, and a restless streak that seemed to drive her from one chapter of life to the next without looking back. As she grew older, Suzanne discovered the power of a good story, not just to entertain, but to manipulate. She wove elaborate tales about her supposed wealthy upbringing, claiming noble lineage, and even boasting of military honors that she had never earned. Her lies were more than just small embellishments. They were part of a larger performance that would become her life's calling card. Suzanne's personal relationships were equally volatile. She married multiple times, often leaving behind accusations of abuse, manipulation, and control. From one of these relationships came her son, James O'Malley, who would later play a role in the dark events to come. Those who knew her described her as magnetic when she wanted to be, a woman who could charm strangers instantly, but equally capable of cruelty, especially toward those who were dependent on her. By the late 1980s, Suzanne had reinvented herself entirely. Moving to Texas, she adopted the persona of a genteel Southern belle, speaking with a drawl and dropping hints of high society connections. In reality, she lived in poor conditions, cluttered homes, unreliable income, and a lifestyle that leaned on the generosity or exploitation of others. Around her, she gathered what she called her family, not bound by blood, but by loyalty and circumstance. This group included her son and a rotating cast of drifters, petty criminals, and vulnerable people who seemed to orbit her influence. Within this small circle, Suzanne was the unquestioned leader, controlling money, decisions, and, eventually, the fate of anyone who crossed her path. It was in this world of half-truths, dependency, and manipulation that Suzanne Basso's deadly plan for Louis Buddy Musso began to take shape, long before he set foot in Texas. The crime. Visuals. A dark screen with white text. August 1998. A slow-moving timeline graphic fades in, marking key dates as the narrator speaks. Reenactments with shadowed figures and blurred faces. A man stepping off a bus. A woman opening a front door. A small group gathered in a dimly lit living room. Close-up shots of hands signing documents. A life insurance form. A pen scratching across the paper. Intermittent cuts to rural Texas roads at dusk. Cicadas humming in the background. Occasional flashes of official crime scene photos, used sparingly and respectfully. In August of 1998, Louis Buddy Musso arrived in Houston, Texas, carrying with him nothing but a suitcase, his faith, and the belief that he was finally about to start a new life with the woman he loved. For months, Suzanne Basso had promised him marriage, companionship, and a comfortable home. But while Buddy envisioned a wedding and a future together, Suzanne was plotting something very different. Not long after Buddy arrived, she quietly made herself the beneficiary of his life insurance policy. It was a calculated move, one that turned his worth, in her eyes, into a dollar amount. And with that paperwork in place, Buddy's dream of a happy ending began to dissolve into a living nightmare. Over the next several days, Buddy endured a campaign of cruelty at the hands of Suzanne and several members of her so-called family. Under the guise of cleaning him, they scrubbed his skin with scalding hot water, harsh bleach, and wire brushes, leaving him raw and bleeding. He was burned with cigarettes, beaten with fists and blunt objects, and berated relentlessly. Each assault was not a moment of sudden rage, but a deliberate, ongoing act of domination meant to break him down completely. The torture escalated until Buddy could barely stand. On the final day, the group's violence turned fatal. Buddy was stomped and battered, his injuries so severe that the medical examiner later noted multiple skull fractures, broken ribs, deep bruising, and evidence of prolonged abuse. His lifeless body was dumped near a remote roadside in Houston, left exposed to the Texas summer heat. The autopsy would confirm what investigators suspected almost immediately. This was no simple killing. Buddy had suffered for days before death finally came, and the evidence of repeated, methodical injuries told a story of human cruelty at its most calculated. By the time his body was found, the woman he had trusted with his heart was already working to distance herself from the crime she had orchestrated. Investigation and trial. Archival shots of Houston Police Department detectives stepping out of unmarked cars. Police interrogation footage of blurred figures across a metal table, hands clasped, eyes darting toward the floor. Courtroom sketches of Suzanne Basso seated beside her defense attorneys, eyes downcast, contrasted with bold-line drawings of the prosecution addressing the jury. Close-up pans across trial documents, life insurance forms, witness statements, autopsy reports, the text highlighted and slowly fading in and out. Audio overlay of gavel strikes echoing under low, tense music. The discovery of Louis Buddy Musso's battered body set in motion an investigation that quickly led detectives to Suzanne Basso's front door. Within days, police had connected her and 5 others, including her own son, to the crime. The web of connections was messy. Petty criminals, drifters, and acquaintances who had all been living under Basso's loose but absolute control. Interviews with the group painted a consistent picture. Suzanne wasn't just present when the abuse took place, she directed it. She decided when Buddy would be cleaned, when he would be beaten, and ultimately, when his body would be disposed of. She was the ringleader, manipulating the others to carry out acts that most could never have conceived on their own. The case moved to trial in 1999, and from the outset, the stakes were clear. The prosecution built a methodical, devastating argument that Basso had lured Musso to Texas under false pretenses, deliberately placed herself as the beneficiary on his life insurance, and then subjected him to prolonged, intentional torture for financial gain. They presented evidence of premeditation, the insurance paperwork, witness testimony, and the chilling details of the abuse. Every piece fit together to reveal a plan fueled by greed and carried out with cruelty. The defense countered with claims that Basso suffered from mental illness, pointing to her history of delusional thinking, fabricated personal histories, and erratic behavior. They argued that she was not fully aware of the consequences of her actions, that she lived in a self-created fantasy world, and that others in her orbit were equally culpable. But the jury was unmoved. In October of 1999, after hearing weeks of testimony and reviewing the grim details of the case, the jury found Suzanne Margaret Basso guilty of capital murder. While her 5 co-defendants received prison terms, some for decades, others for life, Basso alone was sentenced to death. It was a rare outcome for a female defendant, but the jury had no doubt. She was the architect of Buddy Musso's suffering, and in their eyes, the ultimate punishment was the only fitting verdict. Appeals and death row life. A slow, aerial shot of the Huntsville unit's fortress-like exterior, its red brick walls bathed in the soft light of dusk. The camera moves through a dimly lit prison hallway, the sound of distant footsteps echoing. Archival Texas Department of Criminal Justice, TDCJ. Records appear on screen with Basso's name, inmate number, and death row status highlighted. Photographs of the prison yard, viewed through chain-link fencing topped with razor wire. A wheelchair being pushed down a corridor. The figure seated is in shadow, representing her final years. Following her 1999 conviction and death sentence, Suzanne Margaret Basso began what would become a 15-year journey through the appeals process. A journey marked by repeated attempts to challenge her fate and an equally consistent pattern of defeat in the courts. Her attorneys filed multiple appeals, arguing that she was mentally incompetent to be executed. They pointed to her elaborate fabrications about her life, her history of delusional thinking, and behaviors they claimed reflected an inability to fully understand the reality of her punishment. But time and again, the courts were unmoved. State appellate courts rejected her petitions. Federal appeals fared no better, and even the United States Supreme Court declined to intervene. Judges found that despite her eccentricities and questionable mental health history, she met the legal standard for competency. She understood the crime she was convicted of, and she knew the state intended to execute her for it. All the while, the rarity of her situation drew quiet attention. Since the reinstatement of capital punishment in 1976, Texas had executed hundreds of inmates, but only 4 of them had been women. Basso was on track to become the 5th, a statistical anomaly in a system where women make up just a fraction of the condemned. In her later years, prison life took its toll. Reports noted her declining health, including severe arthritis and other ailments that left her wheelchair-bound long before her execution date was set. She spent her final months housed at the Mountain View Unit in Gatesville, the facility where Texas holds its female death row inmates, isolated from the general population, living each day under the shadow of the state's ultimate punishment. As the appeals ran out and the clock ticked toward her scheduled execution date, the inevitability of her end grew heavier, for the courts, for the prison staff, and for Suzanne Basso herself. Execution day. A close-up shot of a wall clock's second hand ticking towards 6 p.m., the solemn hour set by the state of Texas. A slow fade to the exterior of the Huntsville unit at night, its floodlights cutting through the darkness, the air heavy with stillness. A view of the execution chamber, sterile white walls, the gurney's leather straps lying empty, awaiting their final occupant. A shadowy shot of the witness room window, reflecting the dim overhead lights. On the evening of February 5, 2014, the final chapter of Suzanne Margaret Basso's life unfolded with cold precision inside the Huntsville unit. By law, executions in Texas are carried out at 6 p.m., and as the minute hand drew closer, the prison fell into the familiar, unsettling quiet reserved for such nights. Unlike the mythologized drama of Hollywood, there was no crowd outside, no media circus, only a small group of selected witnesses and the slow march of procedure. In the hours before her death, Basso was offered the same choice given to every condemned inmate, a final meal of her choosing. She declined to request anything special, a decision that meant she would be served the standard institutional dinner: chicken, vegetables, bread, and milk, eaten in the solitude of her holding cell. If she tasted it at all, no one could say. She remained mostly silent, her demeanor calm, almost detached. Shortly before the appointed time, she was escorted to the chamber, already seated in her wheelchair. Guards lifted her gently onto the gurney, fastening the thick straps across her arms, legs, and torso. In the witness room, a few of her friends were present, offering small nods of encouragement. No members of Louis Buddy, Musso's family, attended to watch her die, choosing absence over confrontation. As is custom, the warden leaned in and asked if she had any final words. Her reply was brief, spoken in an even tone: "No, sir." She then turned her head slightly toward her friends, offering a faint nod. No apology, no explanation, no plea for mercy, only the quiet resignation of someone who had reached the end of a very long road. At 6:26 p.m., the execution began. A single intravenous line carried a lethal dose of pentobarbital into her veins. Within moments, her eyes closed, her breathing slowed, and the stillness of the room deepened. 11 minutes later, at 6:37 p.m., Suzanne Margaret Basso was pronounced dead. The straps were unbuckled. The gurney stood empty once more, and the chapter of one of Texas's rare female executions closed in silence. Closing reflection. A gentle dissolve into a split-screen image. On one side, Louis Buddy, Musso beaming warmly in a candid family photo, his eyes bright with the openness of someone who saw the world through trust and kindness. On the other, Suzanne Basso's stark prison mugshot, her expression frozen, devoid of the charm she once used to manipulate. The two images lingered together for a moment before slowly fading toward black, the contrast between them a silent commentary on betrayal and loss. Over the fade, a slow montage, a church gathering a quiet Texas road at dusk, the gates of Huntsville unit closing for the night. The story of Louis Buddy Musso is one that forces us to confront the darkest side of human nature. The exploitation of the vulnerable by those who see kindness not as a gift, but as an opportunity. Buddy's life was built on trust, faith, and a desire to belong. But those very qualities became the tools of his undoing. In Suzanne Margaret Basso, he saw a partner, a promise of love and companionship. In him, she saw a means to financial gain, a target for her cruelty. His murder was not the act of a moment's rage. It was the culmination of days of torture, carried out under the guise of care and driven by greed so cold it defies understanding. In American history, female executions are rare. Only a handful have been carried out in the modern era. Yet Basso's case reminds us that cruelty is not bound by gender, and that the capacity for manipulation, violence, and calculated malice exists in every corner of humanity. Her execution on February 5, 2014, closed the legal chapter, but justice in a courtroom is not the same as healing in the heart. For Buddy's friends, family, and community, the wound of his loss remains a reminder of how fragile trust can be and how dangerous it is when placed in the wrong hands. Louis Buddy Musso's life was stolen by someone he believed cared for him. His final days were filled with suffering that no one should endure, and though the state of Texas carried out its sentence, the human tragedy will forever remain. Fade out. Text on screen. In memory of Louis Musso, 1939 to 1998. Soft, slow piano music rises gently, then fades into silence as the screen turns fully black. Final CTA, voiceover. If this story moved you, shocked you, or opened your eyes to the darker truths hidden in plain sight, help us keep bringing these real-life cases to light. Hit the like button to let us know you want more, share this video with friends who follow true crime, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a single jaw-dropping true crime story. Your support keeps these stories alive and ensures that the victims are never forgotten.